The morning sun rose sluggishly over the vast expanse of the northern Pacific, its pale light filtered through thick sheets of cloud and sea mist. The horizon, an indistinct smear between ocean and sky, gave no hint of the drama unfolding upon it. Beneath that brooding sky, the USS Hornet CV-8, a massive floating fortress of steel and steam, carved her path westward through the cold, churning waters. Her gray hull, still freshly painted in the camouflage of war, sliced through the swells with a sense of grim purpose. Every creak of her deck, every blast of sea spray, every beat of her engines carried the weight of a nation's fury. Perched atop her flight deck in a tight, uneasy formation were 16 B-25B Mitchell bombers, twin-engine land-based aircraft of the U.S. Army Air Forces, far too large and far too heavy for any standard aircraft carrier. Their wings overlapped, their propellers silent and waiting. This was a sight no sailor or pilot had seen before, and likely would never see again. The Mitchells were never meant for carriers. Their design was too bulky, their landing gear too delicate, their wingspan too broad. But necessity had become the mother of invention, and desperation had become its father. Now these ungainly guests stood ready, braced against the salty wind like knights atop a war horse built for a different age. This mission was unlike any that had come before it. It was not part of a larger campaign, not a prelude to invasion, not a conquest of land or resources. It was a symbolic strike, a dagger thrown across an ocean, aimed not just at military targets, but at the very heart of the Japanese Empire. A calculated risk, a long shot, a message carved in fire and steel. 4 months earlier, on December 7th, 1941, the unthinkable had happened. Waves of Japanese aircraft, sleek, fast, painted with red suns on their wings, had swept down upon the American naval base at Pearl Harbor like an avenging storm. In less than 2 hours, they sank or crippled 8 battleships, destroyed or damaged over 300 aircraft, killed 2,403 Americans, and wounded more than 1,000 others. The attack had come without a declaration of war, without warning. It had been a masterstroke of surprise, a tactical victory for the Empire of Japan, but it had also awakened something in the American people. Shock and grief gave way to a white-hot rage. Across the country, enlistment lines stretched around city blocks. War bond sales surged. Factories shifted into overdrive. But vengeance, true, tangible vengeance, still felt distant. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the architect of the New Deal, and now the leader of a nation at war, knew the psychological toll of the Pearl Harbor attack could not be answered with words alone. Something bold had to be done, something that would reach across the Pacific and strike fear into the Japanese leadership, something that would show the American people that their nation would not remain passive in the face of aggression. He needed a symbol, a declaration of resolve that would resonate in Tokyo and across the world. It was then that an idea began to take form within the minds of military planners, first as a whisper, then a possibility, then a plan. Could American bombers strike the Japanese mainland? Could the people of Tokyo be made to feel the same fear that Americans had felt on that December morning? Could a handful of bombers, launched from a carrier, reach the enemy's heart and return, or at least survive long enough to land in China? The plan was audacious. Insane, some said. But Roosevelt approved it. The man chosen to lead this impossible mission was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, short in stature, hard in demeanor, and brilliant in mind. Doolittle was already a legend in aviation circles. A test pilot, engineer, and war veteran, he was fearless and fiercely intelligent. If anyone could make the unworkable work, it was him. Under his leadership, volunteer crews were selected, men who understood the risks, knew that they likely wouldn't return, and still stepped forward. They trained in secret, practicing short takeoffs, precision bombing, and long-distance navigation. Every day brought a new challenge, a new refinement, a new chance at success. In March of 1942, the B-25s were loaded onto the deck of the Hornet in Alameda, California. Watching the land disappear behind them, the crews knew there would be no turning back. Their modified Mitchells had stripped down interiors to save weight, extra fuel tanks installed, defensive armaments removed, payloads calibrated for maximum reach. The plan was to launch them hundreds of miles from Japan, fly low across the water to avoid detection, bomb targets in Tokyo and other cities, and then continue westward to friendly Chinese territory. Landing on the Hornet was not an option. There was no going back. This was a one-way trip. Now, with every mile forward, the tension mounted. Japanese patrols were out there, somewhere. The seas were vast, the enemy vigilant. Every morning brought new briefings, last-minute adjustments, and silent prayers. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, gray and cold and indifferent. And still, the Hornet surged forward. To the crews aboard, time felt suspended. They lived moment to moment, their future uncertain, their mission looming like a storm on the edge of consciousness. They knew what was at stake, not just their lives, but the morale of an entire nation. This was a gesture of defiance, a roar in response to a sucker punch, a slap in the face of an empire that thought itself untouchable. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, its light glinting off the polished fuselages of the B-25s, the wind across the deck picked up. Orders crackled over the ship's intercom. The pilots ran final checks. Fuel tanks were topped off. Bombs were secured in their bays. The moment was near. They would launch soon, far earlier than planned. A Japanese picket boat had spotted the task force. The element of surprise was slipping away. But they would go nonetheless. They had come too far to turn back. And so, in those final hours before liftoff, as the USS Hornet continued its lonely charge into enemy waters, the men of the Doolittle Raid waited. Calm, silent, ready. A handful of bombers on a heaving deck in the middle of the Pacific, armed not just with bombs, but with something far more potent. The will of a nation, the fire of vengeance, and the courage to strike the enemy at their very doorstep. The idea came from an unlikely source, a man whose name already echoed through the annals of aviation history. But who was about to carve it into legend? Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Doolittle wasn't just a pilot. He was a phenomenon in a flight suit, an aviator of unmatched skill, a fearless test pilot who had flown the unproven and survived the unthinkable, and an aviation engineer whose doctorate from MIT made him one of the sharpest minds in military aviation. He was equal parts scientist and warrior, capable of solving complex equations in the morning and dodging tracer fire in the afternoon. To his peers, he was a maverick. To his subordinates, he was fearless. To the American war effort, he was about to become something more, a symbol of audacity in the face of despair. In the dark months after Pearl Harbor, when the Pacific was aflame with loss and retreat, Doolittle's mind didn't dwell on defeat. It searched for opportunity. Alongside Navy Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine officer with a curious eye for airfields and aircraft carriers, and with support from Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations and no stranger to bold decisions, Doolittle proposed a raid that sounded more like fiction than strategy. It was born not in a war room, but in the fertile imagination of men who understood that the tides of war often turned on ideas that defied convention. The concept was breathtaking in its simplicity and madness. Launch a squadron of medium bombers, specifically the B-25 Mitchell, from the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. Not fighters, not dive bombers. Medium bombers, machines nearly 60 feet wide and weighing over 15 tons when fully loaded. Fly them westward across the vast Pacific, bomb Tokyo and other major Japanese cities. Then, rather than return to the carrier, an impossibility given the plane's size and lack of carrier landing gear, they would continue westward, over the East China Sea, and land in Free Chinese territory, where friendly nationalist forces could help them evade capture. No American had ever tried anything like it. No military manual accounted for such a mission. It was not just difficult, it was unprecedented. By every technical measure, it should have failed before it began. The B-25 wasn't designed for carrier takeoffs. Its landing gear wasn't reinforced for the jarring launch from a bobbing flight deck. Its wingspan barely fit on the deck of the USS Hornet. The fuel requirements were enormous. The pilots would have to take off with the sea heaving beneath them, with no margin for error. Even one miscalculation could send them hurtling into the ocean. To most commanders, the proposal seemed insane. But Doolittle wasn't most commanders. He believed it could be done, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The psychological blow delivered by Japan at Pearl Harbor had left a scar not only on the U.S. Navy but on the American psyche. Families grieved in silence, cities rallied in anger, and soldiers deployed into a war that had come to them in flames. What America needed now was more than speeches. It needed proof that it could strike back, that Japan, so confident in its island defenses, was not beyond the reach of American steel and fury. The Doolittle Raid, as it would come to be known, was never intended to deliver a knockout blow to the Japanese war machine. Its goal wasn't to destroy factories or decimate infrastructure. It was never about tonnage, dropped, or buildings burned. It was about something deeper, a sudden, unexpected punch that would shake the enemy's confidence and remind them that the war they had started would not be fought on their terms. It was strategic psychology, executed with surgical daring. Preparations began in secret. A select group of volunteers, 80 men in total, were drawn from the 17th Bomb Group, chosen for their skill, adaptability, and willingness to embrace the unknown. They weren't told the specifics of the mission at first, just that it would be dangerous, that it would be historic, and that it might cost them their lives. None backed out. These were the early war warriors, raw, untested by combat, but brimming with purpose. The B-25s were modified extensively. Their rear guns were replaced with broomsticks painted black to fool enemy fighters. Extra fuel tanks were installed in every available space. Bomb bays, crawl spaces, even the tail cone. Every ounce of weight that could be shaved off was removed. The bombers were fitted with special Norden bomb sights, but the crews were trained to drop their payloads manually in case of equipment failure. The pilots trained relentlessly at Eglin Field in Florida and later in California. They practiced short takeoffs from makeshift carrier decks painted onto runways. Again and again, they roared down shortened strips, lifting into the air with only a few hundred feet of runway beneath them, mimicking what they would face at sea. Doolittle demanded perfection, but he led by example. He was not above the danger. He would fly the lead aircraft himself. On April 1, 1942, the USS Hornet departed San Francisco with 16 B-25s lashed to her deck, a sight so strange that even seasoned sailors stopped to stare. The bombers took up every inch of available space. No aircraft had ever launched from a carrier with a payload like theirs. With every mile they traveled west, the mission crept closer to the razor's edge. Secrecy was paramount. If they were spotted, the entire plan could unravel before the first bomb ever fell. The closer they came to Japan, the higher the stakes became. The seas were patrolled by Japanese picket boats and reconnaissance planes. Any premature contact could mean disaster, not just for the raiders, but for the task force itself, which was deep inside enemy waters and vulnerable to counterattack. The plan depended on surprise, timing, and flawless execution. The Doolittle Raid wasn't a military operation in the traditional sense. It was a gamble, a high-stakes all-in roll of the dice made by a nation that had been bloodied but not broken. And at the center of it stood Jimmy Doolittle, a man with the rare courage to bet his life and the lives of his men on an idea that could inspire a nation, unnerve an enemy, and change the very course of the war. Training began quietly in the piney woods of northwest Florida, far from the front lines, in a place where ambition met secrecy and the impossible began to take shape. It was early 1942, and the world was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. America was at war, but the Pacific still belonged to Japan. Into this uncertain moment stepped a cadre of volunteers, 80 airmen selected from the 17th Bomb Group, handpicked by Jimmy Doolittle himself. Most had never seen combat. All swore oaths of silence. They knew only that they were training for a mission that had never been attempted and might never be repeated. At Eglin Field, they drilled in anonymity. There were no press releases, no fanfare, just the grind of men reshaping war around them. The training was relentless. Runways were marked with white lines to simulate the deck of an aircraft carrier. First 500 feet, then 400, then 300. Until they could launch a fully loaded B-25 Mitchell in under 467 feet, the exact length available on the USS Hornet's flight deck. There was no room for error. Each man would have to fly a bomber designed for long runways off the pitching deck of a warship in open ocean. Takeoff wasn't just about skill, it was survival. Everything was tuned for one purpose: flight under impossible conditions. The engines were pushed to the edge of their performance envelope, tuned and retuned for maximum thrust at the shortest possible roll. Anything not essential to survival was stripped away. Gun turrets were removed, armor was reduced, extra fuel tanks were fitted into the bomb bay, crawl spaces, and even beneath the fuselage. Fake wooden broomstick guns were painted black and mounted in the tail to give the illusion of rear defenses. Every pound saved meant more fuel, more range, and a sliver more chance of making it home, or at least to safety. They practiced again and again, flying low, fast, and tight. They rehearsed bombing runs, navigational drills, emergency procedures for ditching in the ocean. They trained for a mission whose target they did not yet know, bound only by the understanding that it would be dangerous, perhaps suicidal. Doolittle watched every maneuver, quietly correcting mistakes, never asking more of his men than he demanded of himself. He would fly the lead aircraft. If they were going to die, he would die first. On April 1st, 1942, the veil of secrecy lifted, just slightly. 16 B-25 bombers were loaded by crane onto the flight deck of the USS Hornet at Alameda Naval Air Station in California. For most of the men, it was their first time aboard a carrier. The Mitchells dwarfed the fighter aircraft typically housed on Navy flat tops. With their broad wingspans and long noses, they looked out of place. Army aircraft lashed down on a Navy warship, like beasts in a cage too small to hold them. Still, the crews were not told where they were headed. They knew only that they would soon cross the vast Pacific, and that whatever lay ahead, there was no turning back. As the Hornet slipped beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, its steel bow cutting the cold waters of the San Francisco Bay, a signal came across the ship's intercom. The voice crackled through the static, flat but unmistakable. "Tell the boys their target is Tokyo." A moment of silence hung in the air, and then it broke. Cheers erupted from the air crews. Grins spread like wildfire. Fists pumped the air. The mission, at last, had a name and a purpose. They would strike the heart of the empire. For many, it would be a one-way trip. But it would not be a forgotten one. Accompanying the Hornet was a powerful escort, the aircraft carrier Enterprise, whose fighters would provide cover for the bombers before launch. a protective screen of cruisers, destroyers, and oilers, and under the command of Admiral William Bull Halsey, one of the Navy's most aggressive battle commanders. The task force steamed west across the Pacific under absolute radio silence, zigzagging through open ocean, watching the skies, scanning the waves. Every eye was alert for Japanese patrols. Every mile forward was a gamble. They were sailing into enemy territory with no margin for error. If spotted too early, they would be attacked before the bombers could even launch. If the bombers ran out of fuel before reaching China, they would ditch into the sea. If captured, they would face brutal interrogation, execution, or worse. The B-25s could not land back on the Hornet. There was no space, no gear, no hope of retrieval. The plan was to strike and escape westward, skimming over Japan, dropping bombs on military and industrial targets, then continuing on over the East China Sea, landing on airstrips or rice paddies controlled by Chinese nationalist forces. Then came April 18th. The morning began like any other aboard the task force, gray, tense, and quiet. But at approximately 7:38 a.m., one of the Navy destroyers picked up a contact on radar. A Japanese picket boat, part of a vast network of wooden patrol vessels scattered across the ocean like a spider web, had spotted them. The boat, a trawler converted into a floating watchtower, radioed a warning back to Japan. The USS Nashville opened fire, sinking the vessel, but the message had already been sent. The element of surprise, the razor edge of the mission, was lost. Now Doolittle and Halsey faced an impossible decision. They were still nearly 650 nautical miles from the Japanese coast, over 200 miles farther than the planned launch point. If they waited to get closer, they risked interception by enemy ships or aircraft. If they launched now, the bombers might not have the fuel to reach China. There were no second chances, no alternate plans, no rescue operations waiting off the coast. Every man on board knew what that meant. And still, Doolittle never hesitated. He looked at Halsey and said simply, "We're going." In that moment, history pivoted, not on a battlefield, but on a decision made under crushing pressure. The crews scrambled to their aircraft. Engines roared to life. Propellers spun like saw blades against the rising wind. Men buckled into their seats, checked their gauges, crossed themselves, muttered to God, or said nothing at all. 16 bombers lined up on the deck of the Hornet, their noses pointed at the vast, empty sky ahead. The Pacific rolled beneath them. Japan loomed ahead. It was time to fly. They launched. In heavy seas, with the Hornet pitching wildly, the first B-25 rolled to the edge of the deck. Doolittle himself was at the controls. Engines roared, wind shrieked, and the bomber leapt from the deck into the gray sky. One by one, the remaining 15 aircraft followed. The takeoffs were textbook perfect, a miracle of coordination, skill, and raw courage. The crews flew low across the waves to avoid detection. As they approached the Japanese coast, they climbed to 1,500 feet, their bomb bays loaded with incendiaries and high-explosive bombs. The targets, Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ground. Japanese fighter planes scrambled, but the raiders were in and out in moments, bombs away, smoke trailing from rooftops, fires erupting across factory districts. For the first time, the Japanese home islands were under direct attack. Civilians ran through the streets in terror. Air raid sirens wailed in confusion. Japan had not believed such an attack possible. The psychological effect was immediate. Panic swept the military elite. Emperor Hirohito and his generals were stunned. The illusion of invulnerability had been shattered. A sleeping giant had not only awakened, it had reached across the Pacific to strike at the empire's heart. But for the Doolittle Raiders, the most dangerous part was still ahead. Flying low on fuel, the crews crossed the East China Sea into darkness, rain, and cloud cover. Strong headwinds pushed them off course. Several planes crash-landed in remote mountains. Others ran out of fuel and ditched at sea. Of the 16 aircraft, 15 reached China. One B-25, unable to make it, landed in Soviet-held territory in Vladivostok, where its crew was interned. In China, local villagers and Chinese nationalist forces helped most of the crews escape, but the cost was terrible. 8 raiders were captured by Japanese forces. 3 were executed. 1 died in captivity. The remaining 4 were imprisoned, tortured, and starved for over 3 years. Despite the horrific treatment, they never gave up their loyalty. Back in the United States, news of the raid electrified the nation. Though the physical damage in Japan was limited, the symbolic impact was enormous. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans felt hope. FDR told the press the bombers had come from Shangri-La, fueling myth and confusion. Doolittle, fearing the mission had been a failure, was hailed as a hero. He received the Medal of Honor from Roosevelt himself. The Doolittle Raid had far-reaching consequences. Enraged, Japanese leaders launched a brutal campaign in China, massacring tens of thousands of civilians in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces to punish those who had aided the raiders. But it also altered Japan's strategy. In a bid to eliminate future threats, Japan pushed to expand its defensive perimeter. The result was the Battle of Midway, an American victory that turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. Military historians agree the Doolittle Raid helped set that chain of events in motion. Over the years, the Doolittle Raiders became legends. Their story was taught in military academies, dramatized in books and films, and honored in reunions held for decades. They were not just warriors. They were symbols of defiance, ingenuity, and unity in a time of darkness. Jimmy Doolittle lived to see victory and peace. He passed away in 1993 at the age of 96, revered as a pioneer of American aviation and one of its most courageous commanders. The last of the raiders, Lieutenant Column Richard Cole, who flew as Doolittle's co-pilot, died in 2019 at the age of 103. Their legacy endures. What they did on April 18, 1942, was more than a military operation. It was a message that even in the face of overwhelming odds, even when hope seems distant, courage and innovation can light a fire that changes the course of history. The Doolittle Raid was not the biggest battle of World War II. It was not the most destructive, but it was one of the boldest. A mission of 80 volunteers, flying into the unknown, striking the heart of an empire, and showing the world that America would fight, not just to defend itself, but to defeat tyranny, no matter the cost. In every sense, they flew for all of us.